Restless energy defined Stan's character, making it nearly impossible for him to stay in one place. In his younger years, his love for the outdoors had been his sanctuary, a place where he felt alive. From the rugged trails of the Lake District to the challenging climbs of Ben Nevis, he embraced the wilderness as his escape from the monotony of daily life. Those experiences left an indelible mark, shaping his perspective on resilience and solitude. As time passed, however, the vigor of his youth gave way to the weight of adult responsibilities. His life became a routine of early commutes, demanding hours at work and nights spent balancing the struggles of marriage. Though he cherished his wife Susie deeply, he couldn't ignore the growing chasm between them, a divide filled with unspoken words and unmet expectations. For years, they had coasted through life together, avoiding the harder truths that neither dared confront. Stan exhaled, pushing the stale air of the clinic out of his lungs, and paused at the doorway, soaking in the warmth of the sunlight. He promised himself a cup of coffee when all was said and done, then made his way across the hospital parking lot toward a quiet shopping center. Two boys on BMX bikes were showing off, pulling stunts around the security posts, balancing on one wheel before speeding off down an alley. He trailed behind them slowly, each step deliberate. After a while, Stan found himself staring through the dirty window of the dry cleaners. "Time to pull yourself together," he told himself. As expected, the news had been grim, and his thoughts were muddled in the haze of what he'd just learned. He should have brought Susie with him. Now he struggled to remember why he hadn't. She would have remembered every word the oncologist said, taken notes, asked more insightful questions. Watching the boys jump over cracked pavement, a wave of emptiness and disgust washed over him. It felt as though no time had passed since he, too, had been a schoolboy, filled with the same naive excitement about life unfolding. Now, staring at the bleak suburban scene, he felt like he might already be dust. There wasn't even a cafe here. The diagnosis was bladder cancer, with secondary tumors in his pelvis and chest. The plan was for urgent surgery in 3 days, followed by radiation and chemotherapy. The oncologist hadn't sugarcoated the prognosis. "So I'm likely going to pass?" Stan had asked. The young doctor nodded. "But there's still hope. We'll do our best to manage the pain and give you as much time as possible. Stay positive." Stan steadied himself and pulled out his phone. He tried calling Susie's office, but the call went unanswered. He stood there, silently hoping someone would pick up. "Come on, Susie, pick up. I really need to talk to you. Just this once." Finally, an unfamiliar receptionist answered and said Susie wasn't available. Stan explained that he was her husband, this was an emergency, and he needed to speak with her urgently. After a long pause, the receptionist flatly informed him that Susie was on vacation that day. "You'll have to try elsewhere." Stan was taken aback, and for a moment his own problems slipped away. Susie was always at work. She never missed a day, not due to illness or anything else. He dialed the house number just in case, but it went straight to voicemail. He called her mobile next. She was never good about answering her phone, and sure enough, the call went to voicemail again. Instead of leaving a frustrated message, he sent a text. "Call me back as soon as you see this. Need to talk." By the time he reached his car, there was a reply. "What's the problem?" The response felt weak, but it still hit him hard. Why hadn't she called him back? He dialed again, but once more the call went to voicemail. He felt terribly alone. On the train to London, Susie had no reason to feel guilty, but she still spent most of the ride worrying. Why hadn't she told Stan about the trip? Clifford wasn't her lover, he was just a friend. Stan would have understood if she'd said she was helping him. Her guilt was irrational. She worked long hours and had few hobbies, so she deserved a break. It had nothing to do with Stan. She sipped a large coffee she'd bought at the station and flipped through a fashion magazine. Rush hour had passed, and the train was nearly empty. Despite her worries, she was able to relax and enjoy the moment. Yes, she had come close to cheating a few times over the years, but she hadn't hurt anyone, and that was the important thing. She had met Clifford 3 years ago on a tough day during a corporate law course. They'd worked together on a project for a month, then kept in touch, mostly by phone, to share legal advice. Over time, their conversations grew beyond work, becoming a friendship. Clifford had a sharp sense of humor and a rational outlook on life, a pleasant contrast to Stan's intense and unpredictable personality. Discussions about contract law often led to stories of their personal lives. Susie told Clifford about their struggles with housing. Stan was always fighting with their landlord or neighbors, so they moved frequently. Clifford shared hilarious stories about his own failed relationships, which ranged from dramatic to absurd, while his career thrived. Susie looked forward to Clifford's messages, especially the late-night emails that helped her unwind. What began as professional exchanges gradually evolved into a comfortable friendship, a welcome distraction from her daily pressures. From the start, Susie knew her feelings for Clifford were unprofessional. He intrigued her because he was so different from the men she knew. Stan was sharp and unpredictable. She had to stay on her toes to keep up with him. Clifford, however, was confident, smooth, and never lost his composure or ran out of things to say. Their conversations felt more honest than anything she had with anyone else. She played the role of the wise friend, asking about his personal life, happy that he took her advice seriously. He dated wealthy, well-connected women he met through work, and his love affairs followed a familiar pattern, starting with excitement and ending abruptly for no clear reason. She told him it was because he had trouble committing, that he couldn't trust anyone, and that he only felt in control when things were on his terms. Susie suspected that Clifford enjoyed the thrill of the chase and missed women once he had them. But for a time, he was deeply in love, a man who expressed his feelings openly and with humor, which she found endearing. She agonized over this distant relationship and told herself it would be fine as long as they never met. Aware of the risks, she believed that nothing bad would happen if she followed this rule. Stan had no reason to complain. No one got hurt, and everyone won. Susie and Clifford were close, but completely different. They trusted each other with their problems, but there was no chance of anything beyond a supportive friendship. Susie was breaking her own rule, heading to meet Clifford under exceptional circumstances. He had recently married, but now, devastated, he wrote to her about his wife's infidelity and their separation. He was alone and desperate for help. Susie knew she had to respond, even if it caused issues. Clifford was her friend, and helping him felt like the right thing to do. She could tell Stan the basics. Clifford was just a work friend, without going into the 5 years of secret correspondence. She considered this carefully. Revealing more would only fuel Stan's tendency to blow things out of proportion. And recently, Stan's moody, distant behavior made her hesitate to share her own concerns with him. She soon wondered if her anxiety came from the fear that meeting Clifford would change their friendship. She didn't feel glamorous enough to match his past lovers, and she worried she might disappoint him or irritate herself. But by the time the train reached London, she was glad she was meeting him, hoping it would confirm the unique bond they shared. When Susie got off the train at Euston Station, she saw Stan's text. Irritated, she read it. Stan never texted her. Why now? He also called, but she knew he understood she didn't take personal calls during work hours. Her irritation grew, fueled by guilt. What could be so urgent? She replied, "What's the problem?" but really meant, "Stop ruining my day." Moments later, another text arrived and her mood shifted. Bistro Cafe John Lewis. Can't wait to see you. Love you, Cliff. She tossed a few coins to a beggar on the way to Oxford Circus, forgetting about Stan's message. With no signal on the underground, the text went unanswered. Arriving at the bistro, her spirits lifted when she saw Clifford sitting outside. He turned when she approached, smiling as if they had known each other forever. They greeted each other with a kiss on the cheek. But then, unexpectedly, embraced, like long-lost lovers. It felt simple and freeing, an expression of their relief at being together again. Susie couldn't take her eyes off his face, and Clifford smiled, trying to understand what was happening between them. They sat down for lunch, enjoying snacks, something Stan would never do. Susie ordered a fruit tart with cream, while Clifford went for beer and pork. They laughed at each other's choices. Then Clifford began to tell his story. It was painful, but Susie listened with empathy as he shared how he discovered his wife's affair. She had moved out while he was away on a business trip, leaving only a note. As Clifford spoke, tears filled his eyes, and he gripped his fork tightly. The intensity of the conversation left them both exhausted, and they decided to get some fresh air. After lunch, they walked through the department store, took a taxi to Cleopatra's Needle, then strolled along the Thames, past Downing Street, and up to Trafalgar Square. They even visited the National Gallery to see a new Titian painting. Susie was supposed to be home for dinner, but time slipped away. In the gallery cafe, she enjoyed Clifford's thoughtful, ironic way of speaking and his ability to pick up on her comments without dismissing them. He was a welcome distraction from his personal crisis, talking about work and a complex corporate takeover. They connected on so many levels. Later at a pub, Susie had a glass of wine and, before she knew it, was talking about Stan. It felt wrong to discuss her marriage with another man, but she quickly justified it by highlighting Stan's good qualities, his generosity, courage, and enthusiasm. But she also admitted how distant and withdrawn he had become, how he refused to talk or get help for what she suspected was depression. His sarcasm and cruel words often felt like personal attacks, and she struggled to deal with his moods. Clifford didn't criticize Stan. Instead, he supported her, saying, "We all deserve respect. He has no right to take his issues out on you." It felt good to have someone who understood. Talking to Clifford brought light to the dark corners of Susie's life. She hadn't felt this alive in a long time. For a while, Clifford was happy, and in return, she had a companion who happily joined her for shopping and endless conversations about work, love, and mutual interests. Clifford said it was a mistake not to meet sooner. "We wasted too much time. We need each other," he insisted. Susie reluctantly agreed, but she drew a line. "We can't date again. I love Stan, and being with you puts us in the wrong place," she said. Clifford pressed her. "At least stay for dinner. We need to talk about what happened between us." His voice carried desperation. "For the first time in a week, my life felt worth living," he confessed. "I was in so much pain I didn't know how I'd survive. Thoughts of you kept me going." Susie wanted to get home before Stan and cook dinner so he wouldn't know about her trip to London. The late trains were crowded and risky, and staying would only complicate things further. But Clifford was right. They deserved a dinner together. Still, Susie couldn't shake the feeling she was avoiding the real question. She wanted to stay, but didn't know what it meant. She didn't mean to flirt, but with Clifford she felt safe. He never made her uncomfortable or spoke ill of Stan. She sat next to him, their hands occasionally touching. It felt natural. Neither of them were seeking to exploit the situation. They simply wanted to see where it might lead. Despite the comfort, Susie's guilt lingered. The logical choice was to cool things down and plan another meeting when they had sorted out their feelings. Staying for dinner felt risky, but she didn't know what was right anymore. With an effort, she pulled her hand from Clifford's and excused herself to the restroom. She turned on her phone. Stan had texted, asking her to call. Surprised he didn't follow up, Susie decided to lie. She'd tell him she was in London for a last-minute meeting that ran late. It was a believable excuse. She dialed his number, but he didn't answer. Frustrated, she texted, "Sorry for the delay. Urgent meeting stuck in London. We'll be back late." Sending the text gave her a brief sense of relief. But before she could put her phone away, another message came in. "What meeting at work? They said you're on vacation." Susie's face flushed. Her lie had been exposed. Why hadn't Stan called? What could he know? She tried to focus but was distracted by the immediate failure of her plan. She called Stan repeatedly, but he didn't pick up. She felt a mix of humiliation and defiance. What did he expect if he played these games? She thought. Her next message read, "Didn't mean to bother you. Actually, I'm with my aunt in Tunbridge Wells. She's feeling sick and asked for help. Don't worry, I'll be back tomorrow." Her stomach churned. Why had she said that? She felt alarmed by her own lies. She knew she couldn't face Stan like this, so she decided to stay in London overnight to regain control before confronting him. But then she realized it was wrong. The smart thing would be to stick to her plan and return home. Surprising Stan with a late arrival from Tunbridge Wells seemed safer, and staying in London could risk everything, both with Clifford and with Stan. With a sense of relief at her decision, Susie pocketed her phone and hurried back to Clifford. When she returned, he pulled her close, brushing his hand over her shoulder and neck before kissing her. "You were gone so long, I thought you had run away," he said. She felt comforted, her worries easing as she absorbed his relief. But after a long embrace, she pulled away. She needed to think for both of them. "Cliff, I need a hotel room for the night. Don't insist, but I'm staying in London. We can have dinner without worrying about time, but after dinner, I'll say goodnight. Do you understand? We need to protect what we have." Clifford agreed, kissing her again. "Thank you, Susie. You're a miracle. I don't know what I'd do without you." Despite agreeing to return home, Susie was horrified by her decision to stay. It felt cowardly, like she couldn't face Stan while her feelings for Clifford were still fresh. As Susie sat at the table, she thought, it'll be clearer in the morning. While Clifford called hotels for her, she checked her phone. No new texts. Frustrated, she tried calling Stan again, but there was still no answer. Why was he being so difficult? The silence between them grew, and Clifford, now having found a hotel, suggested they figure out where to eat. To hell with it, Susie decided. She'd enjoy the evening and deal with everything else later. Taking Clifford's arm, she pressed her cheek to his, comforted by his scent. She wasn't sure what was right anymore, and frankly, she didn't care. Over dinner, the conversation shifted. Clifford, eating his lemon tart, said, "Today's been like a miracle. I didn't think I could be this happy again." Susie, quietly moved, admitted, "I want to be with you so much, but I can't. It would ruin everything. We need to be realistic about when we can be together." Clifford agreed, his eyes understanding. "The moments we do have will be precious. Nothing else matters." Susie, whispering, said, "It's a lie. Staying apart is a self-inflicted wound." When they kissed again, Clifford's palm rested gently on her chest, their bodies close. "No intimacy," Susie insisted, her voice shaky. "What we feel has nothing to do with that." Clifford, with quiet intensity, said, "Then what is it, Susie?" "I love you." His hand on her knee, his warmth so close, felt right, but she was careful, not wanting to take unnecessary risks. When he touched her knee again, she placed her hand over his. "Please don't ruin dinner," she said softly. "I've enjoyed this so much. You're charming. I like you, but I'm married. I can't express my feelings like you can." "But can't you say it?" he asked, his eyes pleading. "Do you love me? Even a little bit?" "You know the answer to that," she replied, her heart racing. "Would I be here if I didn't love you?" They kissed again, but this time she quickly pulled away. Looking at Clifford's dark curls and the thoughtful expression in his eyes, Susie knew she loved him. It shocked her. She had always believed her love for Stan would shield her from loving anyone else, but now she realized that it wasn't just about Zex. It was the bond they shared, the closeness. She felt like a teenager caught in her first crush, unsure of what to do. The adult side of her said she should go to bed with Clifford, but loyalty to Stan and fear of making things worse kept her in turmoil. Even as her heart pulled her toward Clifford, she kept saying no. Clifford, understanding her struggle, finished his coffee. It was 10 p.m. now, and Susie, feeling the effects of the wine and her thoughts, went to the restroom, hoping to clear her head. If only she could talk to Stan, she thought, things would be better. But when she checked her phone, there were still no responses. She called home, then Stan's cell again. No answer. Why wasn't he picking up? Panic set in. He knows, she thought. Stan knows I'm with someone else. The thought consumed her. Stan's sharp mind would catch her, and the shame of being exposed would destroy her. Rushing back to the table, Susie, trembling, said to Clifford, "I want to, but I can't. I'm sorry. This is all too much. I can't handle it. It's not right." Relief washed over her as the words left her mouth. She bolted outside into the fresh air, and Clifford followed. They got caught in the crowd heading for the subway. Clifford held her hand, speaking, but Susie wasn't listening. She saw the tears in his eyes and felt a new strength. "We can have one last drink at my hotel," she said, her tone softer. "But that's it. We had a wonderful day. I'll never forget it. And who knows what will happen next? Nothing's for sure." Susie knew she couldn't sleep with Clifford. She wasn't drunk, and she had made it clear that wasn't going to happen. Zex might have been easy, but the guilt, the constant fear of being caught, and the need to lie to Stan made it all too complicated. She had no desire for that life. They went to the hotel bar, and Clifford ordered champagne to mark a special day, one that stood out from their usual routines. Susie, feeling relieved by her decision, enjoyed the drink and kissed Clifford, grateful for his understanding. It felt right. He deserved her affection, and she wanted him to love her. She knew Stan couldn't give her the same, but she could handle it. Everything seemed fine, until later. 2 hours later, Clifford was asleep beside her, smiling gently. Susie was confused. How did this happen? They had shared an intimate moment in the bar, reluctant to show their feelings too openly, but there was no denying their attraction. After finishing the champagne, the night deepened, and emotions ran high. Clifford whispered, "This is so important. I'll treasure this moment forever." Susie responded, "I love Stan, but my feelings for you are real." Clifford leaned in, asking her to prove it, and soon they were in bed together. Clifford was clumsy but persistent, and Susie appreciated his effort, though it wasn't as smooth as with Stan. She let herself be vulnerable, trying to make it special for him. They both hoped the night would be unforgettable, but it wasn't. They were tired and had drunk too much. Despite the passion, they both knew, without saying it, that the physical intimacy had been a mistake. Susie regretted it, feeling that the act had not strengthened their bond, but only complicated things. She had lied to Stan, and that lie weighed heavily on her. Meanwhile, Stan sat alone at home, growing anxious as evening wore on. Susie's absence felt wrong, and soon he realized she hadn't gone to London for work. Her lie was too careless. He recalled the small details, how she had changed clothes before leaving for work, a sign she wasn't going to the office. She was trying to hide her intentions from him. Stan's mind raced through past conversations, particularly one argument over organic milk. Susie had argued for an unusual stance, one he hadn't heard from her before. Could it have come from someone else? He wondered. By evening, Stan was certain Susie was with her lover. The signs had all been there, but he had ignored them. Now it was clear. She had betrayed him. Their once close relationship had changed, and Stan was left facing the truth. Susie had distanced herself long before the lies began. At first, Stan thought his exhaustion was just from being sick. But now he wasn't so sure. Susie, being smart, should have noticed his illness and stepped in to help, as they always had during tough times. He knew he had to snap out of it. He didn't want to waste the rest of his life wallowing in anger and self-pity. Stop whining and move on, he told himself. Pushing through, he made coffee, played London Calling by The Clash, and tried to lift his mood. Susie had left him. Fine, he'd leave her. Death was a final goodbye, after all. As he sipped his coffee, Stan thought back to the few moments in life that had truly brought him joy, like reaching the top of a mountain after a tough climb, the sense of accomplishment and peace. The Lake District was one place he always wanted to visit again, a place filled with youthful memories of camping and climbing. There was nothing stopping him. After a quick online search, he called a hotel and, to his surprise, found a room available. It felt like fate. He packed his bag, wrote a brief note to Susie, and left the house around midnight. On the drive, he saw a missed call from Susie, but didn't bother to check. He didn't want to hear her excuses. 4 hours later, he stopped for breakfast at a quiet auto repair shop, then continued his journey, feeling better with every mile as the mountains came into view. Arriving at the Lake District, Stan felt the weight lift off his shoulders. He changed into his boots and took a walk along the lake, already feeling restored by the fresh air. At the hotel bar, he studied the map for a hike to Scafell Pike, bought some snacks, and set off. The trail was busy with other hikers, but as he climbed, his hips started to ache, forcing him to slow down. He took ibuprofen and pressed on, thinking, I even passed a few slowpokes. As he veered off the main path to Lord's Rake, he met two young women, Bella and Simone, who were unsure about the route. He offered to guide them, explaining his illness as he needed to stop frequently. They were kind and asked insightful questions, and along the way he learned they had just finished their final exams at Lancaster University. Together they reached the top of Scafell, and Stan, though exhausted, found joy in their youthful energy and their genuine concern for him. At the summit, they shared chocolate and then descended to Mickledore before reaching the top of Scafell Pike. The whole time, Stan didn't think about Susie or death. Despite the pain, for the first time in a while, he felt alive again. Susie woke up feeling great after her night with Clifford. She'd sent him home at 2 a.m., and now, after a quick shower and breakfast, she was ready to head back to London. She felt a sense of relief that her little adventure had gone smoothly, though she realized she was running late for work. The events of the night seemed easier to process with the benefit of sleep. So what if she'd given in to temptation? That was behind her now. She had handled the situation well, acted on her beliefs, and survived. Time to get back to normal. On her way home from the station, Susie changed into the outfit she had left behind the day before. She was in control again and ready to face Stan. The panic she had felt was a distant memory. She quickly showered and put on a business suit, determined not to be late again. If she met Clifford again, she'd suggest a day trip to Cambridge, something Stan wouldn't enjoy, but she could share with Clifford. When Susie got home, she found the house empty. She was disappointed. She had hoped to clear the air with Stan immediately. Now she would have to hold on to her explanation until evening. She glanced at the note Stan had left her on the bulletin board. It read, "Received bad news. I left to think. Not sure when I'll be back. At least on Friday. Hope you enjoyed your night in London. Say hi to your friend for me, Stan." Susie read it several times. Her first reaction was irritation. What was Stan playing at? The bad news sounded vague, and she wondered why he couldn't be clear about it. Was his mother ill? Did he lose his job? He worked for a volatile company, and maybe his luck had run out. Or had he been fired for losing his temper? Stan was smart, but his temper wasn't always under control. The sarcastic mention of her friend bothered her too. Stan was trying to make her feel guilty. She called his cell phone, but there was no answer, so she rang his work and spoke to his secretary, who sounded awkward. "Stan took sick leave," the secretary said. "Sick leave?" Susie asked, confused. "Yes, he's off until the end of next week." "That's ridiculous. Stan isn't sick." Susie insisted. The girl was uncomfortable with the topic of pain. Susie hung up, feeling unsettled. Could Stan really be ill? He had hidden it well, but now that she thought about it, he had been moving slower recently, dragging his feet up the stairs and struggling with simple tasks. Had she missed the signs? Her stomach churned. Was Stan covering up his emotional pain with a physical illness? Could he have found out about Clifford? The idea made her feel nauseous. But why had Stan acted so impulsively, disappearing without telling her? She needed to talk to him, but couldn't shake the fear that he knew about Clifford. After a deep breath, she checked her phone for recent calls. Among the missed calls was an unfamiliar number from the previous afternoon. She dialed it. "Good morning, Wastewater Hotel. How can I help you?" A voice answered. Susie quickly pieced things together. "I'm looking for my husband's reservation. Stanley Marshall," she said. "Yes, ma'am. He's booked a single room for tonight." That was strange. If Stan was really sick, why would he go to the Lake District alone to hike? She knew Stan used climbing to clear his mind, but it didn't make sense for him to go mountain climbing while pretending to be ill. He had to be lying about something, and there was only one explanation for why he'd left without telling her. Susie was in tears, overwhelmed by guilt and the damage she'd caused. She called into work, claiming a family emergency, not thinking about rescheduling meetings or missed deadlines. She wasn't much of a walker, but she had the right gear, a map, and GPS. She ignored 2 texts from Clifford, still no word from Stan. After her coffee, she headed to the car. Stan, meanwhile, had a dull ache in his hip, much better than the pain he'd felt earlier on the freeway. He needed to rest. He gave Bella some money for drinks while he and Simone made their way through the crowded hotel bar and found a spot by the coal fire. The warmth felt good, and he relaxed, though he was still exhausted. The bar buzzed with laughter and talk of mountain hikes. Bella chatted away, and Stan forced a smile. It was only when Simone returned with drinks that he felt a bit better. They planned for the girls to freshen up in his room before heading back to university. After they ate, Stan chose a beef pie and chips, but couldn't eat much. The girls finished his food, and Stan glanced around the bar, deciding on his next beer. That's when he spotted Susie standing out in the crowd. He was stunned. What was she doing here? Before he could think further, Susie saw him, her uncertainty clear. On impulse, Stan kissed Bella and Simone on the cheek. "Before you go, thank you for today. I hope we'll remember this as a special day," he said. When he stood up, Susie was right there, looking angry. "How did you find me?" Stan asked, forcing a smile. "This is Bella and Simone. They're my friends. Don't worry." All 3 women looked confused. "Maybe it's time for you girls to freshen up," Stan suggested, his voice flat. As the girls left, Susie turned to him, her voice tight. "Stan, what's going on? And who are these girls? I read your note. What does it mean?" "They're students from Lancaster University," Stan explained. "We met on the hike. Their energy helped me get to the top of Scaffell Pike." Susie, frustrated, asked, "But what about you? Why did you leave without telling me?" "I sent you a message saying we need to talk, but that's not important now." "You didn't need to come here. A phone call would have sufficed." Susie felt a twinge of panic. "What happened? What did you want to tell me?" Stan shrugged. "I just needed some human support. The girls were kind enough to give it. I went to the hospital yesterday, had some tests. I've got cancer, bladder cancer." Susie froze, gripping the table. "I knew it. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I tried, but you didn't answer my calls." "You were too busy with your aunt, remember?" he replied, voice flat. "I didn't go to visit my aunt," Susie admitted, her voice shaking. "I lied to you. I shouldn't have." She closed her eyes, feeling sick. "I should have been there for you. I'm so sorry." Stan regarded her carefully. This was unlike his wife. "It doesn't matter," he said. "This is about me now, not about your guilt. We all die alone anyway." "Please, Stan," Susie whispered. "Let me take care of you. I want to help." "Forget about me," he said, his tone harsh. "What's wrong with you? How's your aunt?" Susie couldn't hold back the tears. "Stan, I came for you as soon as I could, but I had to go to London." She hesitated. "I didn't visit my aunt. I lied about that. I'm sorry. But this is the worst time to tell you everything." Stan nodded slowly and, in a small gesture of care, handed over a 20-pound note to a man behind them, asking him to get drinks. "My leg's killing me," he muttered. Susie looked at him, noticing how pale and worn he looked. "What's wrong with your leg?" she asked. "I hiked too much. My hip's shot," he replied, looking miserable. Susie could see how much pain he was in. His face was gray and drawn, and the reality of his situation hit her hard. It felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Susie leaned across the table and kissed Stan, her voice trembling. Listen to me, Stan. Don't hate me until you hear everything. I love you, and I'm so sorry for what I did. I'll never forgive myself for not being there when you needed me. I won't leave you until I die." Stan felt a cold emptiness. He didn't want to hear this, but it was better to know than live in the dark. Susie began hesitantly, and he pressed her to keep going. When she hesitated to name her lover, Stan demanded the truth. "Shut up with the half-truths. I don't want to hear lies." She started crying again, but he didn't comfort her. After a moment, she spoke. "His name is Clifford. I met him in law school. We only started talking again about work, but we didn't meet until yesterday. It wasn't an affair." Stan's voice was sharp. "How many letters? 10? 100? "More like 1,000, she admitted, avoiding his gaze. "We never meant to meet. It wasn't like that. But then something happened," Stan pressed. "His wife left him," she replied, shaking her head. "You said it was a professional relationship," Stan said. "And now you're telling me he came to you with his personal problems, and you stayed the night?" "It wasn't like that," Susie protested. "It was late, and he was in a bad state. I didn't want to rush back. He's not my lover." Stan scoffed. "He didn't know his marriage was falling apart." "No," she said, her voice soft. "We're not lovers, and I don't love him." "Lies," Stan muttered, glaring at her. "You spent the night comforting him. You both pretended there was no affair, but you lied to yourself to make it okay." Susie tried to defend herself. "It wasn't like that. I didn't go there for that reason." "Then why was it a secret?" Stan shot back. "Why didn't you tell me about it?" "I didn't need to," she said, voice shaking. "There's nothing to hide." Stan's eyes narrowed. "How do I know that?" "You'd lie about it, just like you've been lying to yourself." She stood silent for a long moment, then whispered, "Maybe I do love him. I can't deny it. But that doesn't change how I feel about you. I'll always love you too." Stan's expression hardened. "That doesn't change anything. When I needed you, you were comforting him. Maybe you never thought marriage came with responsibilities, not just benefits." "No, Stan," Susie protested. "If I had known you needed me, I would have come. You know that." Stan shook his head. "You make it sound like you'd only help when it's convenient. That's not how marriage works." "I tried to call you," she said, her voice breaking. "But you were too busy with her to pick up. I couldn't reach you." Stan looked away. "Come with me now. I won't hurt you anymore. We can get through this together." Stan shook his head again, staring blankly ahead. A waiter came over with their drinks, casually sliding a few coins onto the table. "Use it for the rest," he said, smiling at Susie. "And tomorrow, get out on those hills." Stan took a slow sip of his beer, thinking to himself, "It's good you have someone else. I had a decent time today, despite everything. I'm not the same, but I don't need your pity. The health service will take care of me. I'll go home soon to pack for the hospital, but I won't get in your way." "Come back with me," Susie pleaded. "We'll get your car later." Stan shook his head, his expression distant. "I'll stay here as long as I can. While the weather's good, you should go back to him. Think about your future." "I'll stay with you," she insisted, her voice thick with emotion. "We'll make it work." Once more, he shook his head. "I don't want you here. I don't want to feel angry. I want peace. Why should I have you reminding me of everything that's gone wrong in my life? You're just as much a symptom of the illness as the pain from my cancer. I don't need your pity or your spare time away from your lover." Their conversation was interrupted when Bella and Simone returned with drinks, but clearly didn't want to intrude on Stan and Susie's tense exchange. He embraced them both. "Don't mind me. If you have things to do at the university tomorrow, you should go. I'll manage on my own." "Will your wife stay?" Bella asked softly. He shook his head. "It's a tough life caring for a sick husband and a lover. She needs to go back." "We've decided to stay," Bella replied. "We can take the time, and we enjoyed our walk today so much that we'd like to continue tomorrow. But we won't take your bed. We'll sleep on the rugs in your room. If we all get up early, we can go with you in the morning and head straight to the university after. It's early enough for us." Tears welled up in Stan's eyes. How is it that strangers can be so kind? They even tried to protect his pride by suggesting they were staying for themselves, not for him. "Let's go up to Pillar and Steeple," Bella suggested gently. "I went up there in the clouds, and I'd love to see them in all their glory, but only if you want to." "I'm a vampire, draining the life out of you young women," Stan replied with a bitter smile. "I can only do this with your help." They assured him it was a great plan and went to bed. Susie left without Stan noticing. Susie was lost in her thoughts as she drove home through the narrow roads out of the Lake District. Exhausted and humiliated, She couldn't shake the feeling that Stan had more or less told her to leave. And why had Stan made such a scene with those girls? It felt like an attempt to humiliate her. The roads were empty, and by the time Susie reached the highway, she had come to terms with the fact that Stan might have had some reason for his behavior. She didn't want to upset him, but she did want to make things right. She needed time to show him she still cared and would do everything she could to support him through his illness. It was just bad luck that she hadn't answered the phone when he got his diagnosis, but if he let her go to the hospital with him, there would have been no problem. Stan would understand that once he calmed down. She was proud of herself for being honest about Clifford. No matter what happened now, Stan couldn't accuse her of lying. She would be ready for him to come home, confident that she could make things right. After all, it was in his best interest for her to take care of him, visit him at the hospital, and look after him when he returned home. She planned to talk to her employers and was sure they'd grant her maternity leave so she could focus entirely on caring for him. Tomorrow, she would tell Clifford what had happened. He would help her put everything into perspective, and he would understand that her husband had to come first now. She arrived home at 3 a.m, fell into bed, unwashed and exhausted, but convinced she had done the right thing. She fell asleep almost immediately. Meanwhile, Stan had returned to the hospital and sat alone in the oncology waiting room. The tests from his doctor had gone missing, and he couldn't be scheduled for surgery until they were found. He waited for an hour, feeling forgotten. The clerk eventually told him someone was waiting in the preparation room to retake the tests. He sat back on the bed in the small prep room, continuing to wait, feeling as though he was waiting for his life to be decided. There was nothing to read, nothing to look at outside the window. Another hour passed. Naturally, he had a lot to think about. Left alone in a quiet room, his anxiety began to escalate into panic. He must be a coward, he thought, as every muscle and nerve in his body urged him to leave. Why let the doctors operate on him when there was no hope? He also tried to make sense of his brief exchange with Susie. He returned home from the north overnight and arrived at 7 a.m. to find Susie waiting for him, sitting at the kitchen table, ready to leave for work. She told him she had packed a hospital bag for him and that she would visit him in the evening. He refused the coffee because he wasn't allowed to eat or drink before the appointment and told her not to worry about the visit. "I'll still be under anesthesia," he added. She asked about the surgery details and what special care he'd need when he returned home. Clifford wasn't mentioned, though he was clearly between them like a silent wall. "Don't come at all," Stan said bitterly. "I don't need your sympathy, and I might just think you're checking to see if I'm dying fast enough." He felt a sense of satisfaction with his words, but Susie looked like he'd struck her. "I won't come if you don't want me to," she replied sharply. "But don't pretend it's about me and Clifford. I've seen him once every 5 years because he needed a friend. Big deal." "Don't bother," Stan sneered. "This is just drama. Cheating is simple. It's about ego and people who can't control their greed, who lie because they think it's the easiest way. When they want something, they take it, and everyone else can go to hell. Got it? Now leave." Susie left for work, holding back tears, and Stan felt a bit better after their confrontation. Alone in his room, he was suddenly overwhelmed with the desire to take control of his life. It had been a mistake to let doctors decide his fate. Before he could act on the thought, a young doctor came in, read his chart, and looked at him like a nervous student. "What are you doing here?" the doctor asked. "You should be in pre-op by now." "I was told I had to complete some tests first," Stan replied, frustrated. "That's nonsense," the doctor said. "Go to pre-op now." Stan stood up, his mind made up. Life couldn't get any worse, and it was time to stand up for himself. He walked out of the oncology ward, feeling lighter. By the time he reached his car, he knew he'd made the right decision. He had a few good days or weeks ahead, but the alternative of being sedated into unconsciousness on an operating table was worse. He would enjoy whatever time he had left. He stopped for coffee and a Danish before heading home, arriving 3 hours after Susie left for work. To his surprise, her car was in the driveway, along with an unfamiliar black BMW convertible blocking his spot. He parked on the road, walked past the car, and then went around the back of the house, not wanting to deal with any visitors. He retrieved the spare key from the pot of flowers in the greenhouse and let himself in through the kitchen. The coffee machine was brewing, but as he stood there, he heard voices in the hall, Susie's and a man's. He immediately knew it was Clifford. Despite everything, he wasn't prepared for the betrayal. The instinct to confront them was strong, but his anger was sapped by his illness. He felt stunned and unsure of what to do. Part of him found it almost comical to eavesdrop on the conversation, but he also knew he had to face them. He retreated to his small office, closed the door to muffle the voices, and sat down. His anger gradually settled, and the reality of the situation hit him. He shouldn't let Susie's betrayal dominate his final days. There were more important things to focus on. His eyes scanned the room, filled with memories, shelves of books, his stereo system, the old computer. He had made his decision. He would leave for good this time. He grabbed his bag of walking clothes, but before heading upstairs, his gaze landed on something atop a shelf. His grandfather's ceremonial swords. He took them down. These swords, passed down from his grandfather, had been given to him after his father's death. His grandfather had served in the Navy, participated in the hunt for the Bismarck, and had received the Distinguished Service Order. One of the swords had even been worn to Buckingham Palace when his grandfather received the award. As a child, Stan had imagined wielding the sword in grand battles. Now, holding one of the swords, he knew exactly what he needed to do. If Clifford and Susie thought their affair was justified, he had a surprise for them. He heard footsteps coming into the kitchen, and as Susie went for coffee, Stan quickly locked the kitchen door, securing himself in the hall. He then entered the living room where Clifford was standing by the fireplace. Clifford's smile froze when he saw Stan holding a sword in each hand. The two men stared at each other. Stan threw one of the swords toward Clifford, who stumbled back in shock as it clattered to the floor nearby. "If I were you," Stan said coldly, "I'd take her. You know who I am, so don't be surprised. I'm giving you a better chance than you gave me. Did you think I'd just let you take my wife? You thought I was already dead, didn't you? You made a mistake. Now we'll see how much you love her. Will you fight for her, or do you just want her if it's easy?" He paused, letting the silence hang. "This is a duel to the death. I have nothing to lose. Only one of us leaves here alive." Clifford looked terrified. "Where's Susie? Look, you've got this all wrong. Put the swords down and let me explain." Stan raised his sword, pointing it at Clifford. "Where's your pride? So you're willing to steal her but not fight for her. If you don't fight, you'll still die. I'll liquidate you like a dog. No seconds, no mercy. We'll find Susie, and she can explain everything. But this is a duel. Be a man. Don't hide behind her." Clifford hesitated. "I don't think you stand a chance with my rusty blade in your ribs," Stan sneered. "No, trust me. This is not negotiable. You have 30 seconds to get ready. Then we fight." Clifford's face drained of color. "No, Susie asked me to come. She was upset, said you were sick and needed to go to the hospital. I came to help her. Nothing more." Stan's anger flared. "My wife isn't some consolation prize for you. Shame on you." 10 seconds, Stan said coldly. Clifford stayed still, realizing Stan wasn't joking. The room was thick with tension. Finally, Clifford grabbed the sword, raising it to parry Stan's strike. The clash of blades was sharp and dramatic. Stan paused, trying to steady himself. He was weak from illness, but he had trained with a foil in school. He raised his sword and swung at Clifford, not caring who won, but wanting a good fight. It was more about proving something to himself. "We're fighting for Susie," Stan said. "Let's see if you'll die for her. I'll leave her for good if I win. Be a man." Stan attacked again, but Clifford dodged, almost cowering. The fight couldn't last long. The sound of banging from the kitchen distracted Stan for a moment. Clifford parried another blow, but now he started to counterattack. He raised his sword and lunged, but in his desperation he ran straight into Stan's blade. The sword shattered at the hilt, and Clifford collapsed to the floor, the jagged piece of steel lodged in his chest. Stan dropped his sword, his gaze fixed on Clifford, who lay motionless on the floor. He walked over and unlocked the kitchen door. "Stan, what did you do?" Susie rushed in and saw Clifford on the floor, blood everywhere. She knelt beside him, then hugged him. "It's too late," Stan said flatly. "Your lover paid the price for your choices." Stan didn't need to think too hard about what came next. He grabbed his bag and didn't even check if Clifford was dead. He was sure enough. He'd seen enough blood to know when the job was done. It wasn't about revenge. Eliminating Clifford hadn't fixed anything with Susie. He couldn't even bring himself to care about her anymore. Stan got in his car and drove. 10 miles, 20, he just kept going. He didn't know where, but he didn't want to think. He bought painkillers at gas stations along the way, knowing he'd need them for the pain, not to end things. He was avoiding the highways, worried about being recognized, but mostly, he didn't want to deal with what he'd done. By nightfall, he had found a quiet road near Kendal, spent the night sleeping in his car. The next morning, he drove to St. Bees Head, a starting point for a long walk across northern England. He had breakfast in a small cafe, then set off with just a light bag, water, chocolate, a waterproof jacket. For a while, he was alone, walking at a slow pace. But over time, others passed him, offering advice on the route and the weather. Some would stop for lunch or meet at pubs in the evening. It was tough, but peaceful, and no one asked him about the sword-wielding butcher they'd seen in the papers. He realized he no longer looked like the man Susie had once known, the man in the photographs the police had surely shown her. He walked about 10 miles a day. Some days the pain was unbearable, others it was manageable. Whenever he struggled, strangers would stop to help, offering to call for rescue, but Stan always convinced them to let him be. On more than one occasion, he was surrounded by people, practically carried by them. But each morning he found that he still had a few more steps in him. It could have been therapeutic if it didn't hurt so much. Over a week passed and the effort became routine, but the distance shrank every day, and he knew he would never make it to Robin Hood's Bay, the end of the trail. Most of the time he walked in a daze, numb from painkillers. Each step shot a sharp pain into his hip. One day the weather turned brutal. A strong wind whipped across the moors, and hail pelted him as he climbed 9 Standard's rig. The storm blinded him, and he lost his way, stumbling into a peat bog. After a great effort, he freed himself, but exhaustion and pain caught up with him. He found shelter beneath a stone ledge, but his foot slipped on a wet stone, and he fell, hitting the ground hard. This time there was no one around to help. He didn't know how far he had fallen. He could smell the wet peat. Icy water trickled down his collar. Then everything went black. Meanwhile, Susie received a call late that night while having dinner at home. After so many silent weeks, she had stopped expecting news of Stan. The police gave her little information. He was in critical condition, in a hospital in Yorkshire, but he was also in police custody. Susie washed the dishes, trying to push aside her shock, then packed a thermos of coffee and some sandwiches, dressed warmly, and left. The drive would take about 4 hours, and the quiet road ahead gave her time to think. Could her life get worse? She probably didn't want to know. She arrived at the hospital and presented her ID to a sleepy officer at the entrance. Stan had been found unconscious in a bog by hikers and airlifted to the hospital, but had not regained consciousness since. Susie entered his room to find him lying still, hooked up to an oxygen mask. His face was pale, his eyes sunken deep. It was clear he was gravely ill. She sat quietly beside him for a long time, not knowing what to feel. Finally, she kissed his cheek, and to her surprise, he moved. His eyes fluttered open and his hand reached for hers. "Stop the pain," he whispered, holding her hand. His eyes opened fully, and he smiled weakly. "I'm glad you came, Susie." He seemed to drift back to sleep. Susie stayed beside him, still holding his hand. She was stunned by how frail he looked, torn by guilt for his condition, knowing it was tied to her betrayal. His ruined body was a consequence of her choices. She gently stroked the back of his hand, then asked a nurse about his pain management. The nurse explained that Stan had a fractured pelvis, but his cancer had already done too much damage. They were giving him the highest possible dose of morphine, but he was still in severe pain. "Talk to him. Keep him distracted," the nurse suggested. "Make him hold on." Susie sat back down next to Stan, trying not to disturb him. After a while, he opened his eyes again and looked at her. She reached out and gently touched his face. "I'm sorry, Stan, for everything. I wasn't there when you needed me, and I'll never forgive myself for that. I'm not leaving you now." "It's ruined, Susie," Stan replied slowly, his voice barely audible. "It's not your fault. You're here now. That's all that matters." Susie leaned closer as he pulled off the oxygen mask. "I'm sorry I liquidated your friend," he whispered. "He deserved it. But it's not right that I took him from you. You deserve someone to take care of you." "I want you," Susie said, her voice breaking. "It's not fair." He looked at her, his gaze steady. Despite his broken body, his eyes still seemed alive. After a long pause, he said, "That's how it should be. We had something once. It's better to love and lose, as they say. Not everything was in vain." "I need your help to die," Stan whispered, his voice barely audible. "After that, I want you to live. Find someone who will take care of you and forget about me and all this mess." "Don't say that, Stan," Susie cried, tears streaming down her face. "I'm here and I'll stay. I never stopped loving you." "You don't understand," he gasped. "The pain's too much. I can't handle it. I don't even deserve this. We need to say goodbye, and then I want you to help me leave forever." She knew he was serious. It would be like murder if she helped him die. Was this a test? To see if she'd love him enough to liquidate for him? Her tears flowed, unsure what to do but consumed by her own despair. Stan's body jerked in pain. He gripped the sheets, his eyes closing, unmoving. She stroked his face, whispering soothing words, but felt powerless. Desperate, she called for help. A young doctor appeared and reviewed the medical records at the end of Stan's bed. He avoided looking at Stan. "He needs something for the pain," Susie said urgently. "We're doing all we can," the doctor replied, eyes not meeting hers. "More would risk his health. The consultant will review his meds later." "You're not addressing the pain," Susie said, her frustration growing. "What are you saving him for? More suffering?" The doctor shook his head. "You're upset. It's better to take a break. Have some coffee. Gather yourself." Furious, Susie leaned over Stan, kissed him on the lips, and whispered, "I'm sorry, Stan. I was trying to help." She kissed his forehead and left, exhausted and emotionally drained. Despite everything, a strange mix of excitement and sorrow filled her. The policeman at the entrance stood up when she passed. "Go home and get some rest," he said kindly. "Things will look clearer in the morning." In her car, Susie realized she had no place to go. The thought of driving 200 miles back home was unbearable. The sky was beginning to lighten, and she curled up in the seat, falling asleep. At 11 a.m., her phone rang. She woke with a stiff neck and dry mouth, disoriented. It was the ward administrator delivering the news. Stan had passed away during the night. She was told she could pick up his belongings, which would be kept for 24 hours. Susie stepped out of the car and noticed a parking ticket. She walked through the hospital, finding Stan's room prepared for a new patient. She went to the nurse's station, and when the nurse saw who she was, she handed over Stan's phone and wallet. "Stan's at the morgue," the nurse said, explaining that the death certificate listed carcinoma and traumatic injuries as the cause of death. "No autopsy will be done. With aggressive cancers like his, the body just gives up." The nurse's words felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's life. After a month, Susie walked the coast-to-coast route, following in Stan's footsteps. It would have been nice to do it with him, but she found comfort in the solitude the journey brought. She left an apology for Stan under a stone, a message she never had the chance to share. When she returned home, Susie found she had lost interest in her job. A large insurance payout allowed her to quit. The house, full of memories of Stan, was too much to bear. She sold it and moved to London, where she found a low-paying job as a legal advisor for a charity helping young offenders. Her work consumed her, and she met many kind, generous people, some of whom she went out with, though she gained a reputation as distant and dry. Every year she went on hiking trips. Her last was the GR20 route in Corsica. Stan would have loved it, she thought, remembering his passion for hiking. About a year later, Susie received an invitation to a memorial for Clifford. She debated attending, but ultimately decided to go. The service at St. George's Cathedral was attended by around 500 people, and Clifford seemed to have been an important figure. As she watched his family mourn, she couldn't connect them to the man she had known. The service was followed by a reception, but Susie chose to leave early and return to work. She wasn't ready to be part of that world.